This is Rabbi Klein from the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. This is really the first parasha in the Torah, which is really not narrative. It deals almost completely with law. Yes, there is some narrative at the end, but the vast majority are laws and specific types of laws. Yes, there are also ritual laws, but really this week's parasha deals with laws of damages, laws of homicide and manslaughter, laws of theft, laws of torts, all kinds of property law and civil law. And the question is, why? Why does the Torah open up with all this civil law? Rashi, in the first comment of this week's parsha, says, Ve'ele ha-mishpatim, and these are the laws. Remember last week's parsha, we had the exalted 10 Commandments. And he says, just like the 10 Commandments was given at Sinai, so too all the civil laws. The civil laws were given at Sinai. So what's the point that he's making? To answer this question, I'd like to make an observation that the rabbis make, a distinction between two types of mitzvot in the Torah, chukim and mishpatim. Chukim are generally seen as ritual laws. Laws like keeping kosher or keeping Shabbat. These would be called chukim. And then we have the mishpatim, the laws between human beings, interpersonal laws, what we would call civil laws. The first types of laws, the chukim, talk about my relationship vertically with my sense of God or the eternal. And the second type of laws, mishpatim, talk about the horizontal, my relationships with other people. And so we have these two types of laws that are intermingled in the Torah. And Rashi is making an important point to say that just like the laws of Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments were given, so too are all these civil laws. And Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman was a rabbi in Germany in the second half of the 19th century, and he tried to bridge the world of faith and modern thought. And he wrote a commentary on the Torah, and he comments on the following question. He says, like we said last week, that the two tablets of the law, the two tablets of the 10 Commandments, have both on the first tablet the laws between humanity and God, and the second tablets between man and his fellow man. And now, this week's parsha goes further in depth in terms of looking at laws between human beings, interpersonal law. And they seem to be an expansion on the second set of tablets, he says. Now, he says the following. This week's parsha opens up with mitzvot that shape human society. However, he asks a fundamental question that many of us would ask. Do you need revelation at Mount Sinai to teach me not to murder, not to steal, to do all these terrible things? Isn't this obvious? Any civilization needs basic civil laws if it's to remain civilized. It's a good point. In fact, do you need to be religious to be a good person? We know many people that are very, very moral and good people and yet are not religious at all. However, I think what Rav David Tzvi Hoffman points out in his commentary is it's not that we wouldn't know some of these laws without the Torah. It's rather the root of these laws. Where are these laws of justice, of ethics, and morality rooted? This is critical. These values, just like the ritual values, are based for Rav David Tzvi Hoffman at Mount Sinai. Not any social contract or human consensus. And why is that so significant? Reb David Tzvi Hoffman explains. He says that there's a danger if we don't see justice rooted in the absolute. For while there might be stability and justice for a period of time, unless, he says, the law of the state appeals to a higher source, unless there are standards that are grounded in the absolute, these institutions can fall apart. In other words, the institutions of justice are not just utilitarian, based upon the whims of any people at a given moment, or based upon who's in power at any moment. And he provides an instructive image for us to consider. He says, "Rak kasher ruach Hashem po'elet b'medina k'neshama zu, rak az muftach lo hanetzach, יש בה עושר אמיתי, שעוררים בה צדק ומשפט, וכל פרט שבה הוא משענת חזקה לכלל. Only when the Spirit of God permeates society like one's breath, only then is there ultimate stability. Only then is there true happiness. Only then is the justice and righteousness and every law permeating society. He notes that when there's a dispute among two people in society, they don't go to just judges. It says, V'nikrav el ha'elohim, that they go before judges. And the word for judges in Hebrew here is Elohim, the same word for God. Now, isn't that interesting? Because judges are supposed to execute the justice of God, not society in a sense. They are involved in sacred work. So the same word for judges is the same word for God. Justice are divine values, are absolute values that cannot be compromised due to any other considerations. And I'd like to bring a modern application, especially given the events of this week. A person has to understand that justice and law is larger than themselves, and law should not bend to one's wishes and desires. Justice is certainly to be seen in the Torah as larger than any person, any institution, or any political interest. The Torah demands that the laws are rooted in divine values of justice that are eternal. The Torah demands that we understand that a court of law is a sacred institution. It's Vanikrav Elohim. You go before God, in a sense. And that the judges have a sacred responsibility to bring justice, this divine value, into this world. It's absolute. Now, conversely, he also points out that without standing for values of absolute justice and righteousness, ritual laws can mean nothing. They're not a meaningful expression of my connection to anything larger or anything transcendent. But these are the words he used. An attempt to create for oneself permission to violate civil laws. In essence, we wrap ourselves up in the accoutrement of piety, and yet we pursue our own needs, our own goals. People use the disguise of religion to cover up my self-interest and my selfish needs. He quotes the book of Psalms, the 50th Psalm, which speaks about those people that are involved in sacrificing to God. They look so religious, and they pretend. And this is what God says to them. He says, "Who are you to recite my laws and mouth my terms and my covenant, seeing that you actually spurn my teachings and brush all my words aside? When you see a thief, you fall in love with him and throw your lot with adulterers. You devote your mouth to evil and yoke your tongue to deceit." There was a very famous Musar rabbi named Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and he wrote a book called the Igeret Musar. And he says the following: religious people would never, ever think about eating treif, eating something non-kosher. In fact, they would never sell non-kosher meat to one another in the fear that they would bring themselves to sin or other people to sin. Yet, he says, interestingly, in business and the production of kosher food, he says, those standards are not applied. Maybe that there's price fixing going on. Maybe they're not treating their workers correctly. Maybe there is abuse of workers. And so interestingly, people that feign religiousness can so easily then violate basic moral laws of justice, which are also divine laws, just as much as the ritual laws, he says, Reb Salanter. He gives another image of people that would be very careful to wash before eating hamotzi. They wash their hands, but yet are not so, once they're eating and talking with one another, are not as careful about what comes out of their mouth, which we know, lashon hara, speaking evil about one another, is akin to shedding one's blood. It reduces their divine image. And that is actually more important than washing before a meal, he says. They're both interrelated. In fact, in America, we have an institution that some Orthodox rabbis created called Tava Yosher, for kosher establishments, where we want to make sure that things are ritually slaughtered correctly, but also that kosher establishments ensure that the work environment is fair, that there's fair pay, that the hours of workers are reasonable, and that there are safe work environments. These things are as important. So therefore, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman says that one cannot hide behind the religious laws without actually also enforcing justice. So in conclusion, I want to go back to the first Rashi. The first Rashi says at the very end that the court of law in ancient times was put right next to into the altar. And why? Because the Mishpatim and the Chukim, the relationships between human beings and the relationships between human beings and God, they're two sides of the same coin. One cannot exist without the other. Justice is not just a human value. It's not just what we agree to as a society that can be bent to our own wishes. It's a sacred value. It's absolute. And God is part of the equation. And the second thing, we cannot delude ourselves into thinking that we are a religious people while neglecting the absolute ethical standards that this week's Parashat demands. Wishing all of you Shabbat Shalom.